On behalf of the Canadian Breast Cancer Network, I'd like to welcome you to our educational webinar on subsequent entry biologics. My name is Craig Foss, and I'm the Operations Manager with the Canadian Breast Cancer Network, and pleased to be your moderator for today's session. We would like to thank our partners at Hoffman LaRoche for making this webinar possible through an unrestricted grant. Before we begin, I would like to take a few minutes to provide an overview of the agenda for this evening. Our expert speaker, Cheryl Koehn, will share her presentation, which will be followed by opportunity for participants to ask questions. You'll notice a question box at the right-hand corner of your screen. You can submit questions by typing them into this box either throughout the presentation or at the end. The webinar will last for 1 hour and be finished by 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded to allow for on-demand viewing. You'll be able to view the recording on our website at cbcn.ca. Lastly, an email will be sent to you in the next 24 hours asking you to complete an evaluation of this evening's webinar. This will only take a minute or two of your time, and we greatly appreciate your feedback as it directly impacts future programming. I am sure there are many in the audience tonight who are wondering what subsequent entry biologics are. Until very recently, I knew very little about SEBs. This is not an issue that will dramatically affect the breast cancer community for about 5 years or so until prominent breast cancer treatments are scheduled to come off patent. This slide here shows the schedule for important breast cancer biologics and their current patent expiry dates. With that said, we felt it's important to start the discussion on this topic early and took this opportunity to learn from the arthritis community, who has been at the forefront of this issue. So without further delay, I would now like to welcome our expert speaker for this evening, Cheryl Koehn. Cheryl is an arthritis advocate, community leader, published author, and rheumatoid arthritis survivor for 26 years. Ms. Cohen has dedicated her life to helping others living with arthritis as well as people with other chronic diseases. She is the founder and president of Arthritis Consumer Experts, a national organization that provides science-based information and education programs in both official languages for people with arthritis. She served as co-chair of the Summit on Standards for Arthritis Prevention and Care, co-founded the Best Medicines Coalition, and was the two-time chair of the Better Pharmacare Coalition. Ms. Cohen is presently the Consumer Representative Board Member of the Arthritis Alliance of Canada. As one of North America's leading arthritis advocates, Ms. Cohen provides a patient perspective of arthritis health and policy issues across Canada and internationally to governments, private payers, healthcare professionals, and media. She is a frequently invited speaker at national and international arthritis and healthcare conferences. With her team at Arthritis Consumer Experts, Ms. Cohen has led the development of numerous information and education innovations to the arthritis community, including the Arthritis ID and Arthritis ID Pro iPhone apps, Arthritis Broadcast Network, the annual report card on provincial formulary performance for inflammatory arthritis medications, and Canada's Best Workplaces for Employees Living with Arthritis Award. As we've already stated earlier, Ms. Cohen joins us from sunny and warm Vancouver, British Columbia, where she enjoys ocean swimming, playing tennis, and walking her faithful dog, Molly. Welcome, Cheryl. Thank you for joining us this evening. I will now turn the session over to you.
Thank you very much, Craig, and to the Canadian Breast Cancer Network for inviting me to speak with those of you on the phone today to talk about a topic that certainly isn't, I wouldn't consider a subsequent entry biologics sort of the garden variety conversation at your local coffee house, but certainly one that is important to people who are living with diseases like breast cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, many people across this country who are affected by an autoimmune disease. And then, of course, this topic of subsequent entry biologics and their safe management as a new option, treatment option in the Canadian healthcare system is a very important one. So I'm grateful to the Canadian Breast Cancer Network for extending me this opportunity to speak to you today. We're going to go through this next 30 minutes really taking a high-level look at subsequent entry biologics, firstly by setting for you the context. Why, first of all, did Cheryl Koehn get interested in them? Why is the arthritis community over the past 5 years been not only interested and acquired knowledge about them, but actually been involved in how they have entered the Canadian landscape? why we think that people who are affected by breast cancer, either currently as a patient, as an advocate, as an informal or formal caregiver, or someone who works in the community, why we think you should be interested in this topic. Talk very high level about what they are. This is not a science talk. I don't have tons of dazzling scientific slides, which you'll probably be grateful for. I do have a slide that gives a very high-level overview of the regulatory and reimbursement landscape in Canada, not only for subsequent entry biologics, for all medications, and then we'll give you what arthritis patients and our community have formulated as an opinion based on professional group thoughts and insights, and then talk a little bit about what might be ahead for the breast cancer community. So to set the context for the topic of subsequent entry biologics, you really need to start about the year 2000, when biologic response modifiers, so the originator of medicines, came into the marketplace and marked a new era in the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. This class of medications called biologic response modifiers truly changed the landscape. Prior to the year 2000, there had been absolutely no treatment innovations for rheumatoid arthritis. That everything prior to the biologic era, its use in the disease was discovered serendipitously. So in other words, methotrexate, the cancer drug, we found out in lower doses, people being treated with it for cancer and also had rheumatoid arthritis, their rheumatoid arthritis improved. So that's sort of the serendipitous discovery of our mainstay treatment prior to the year 2000 was actually discovered in the cancer community. Once those biologics were approved by Health Canada, it really became the responsibility, I feel, of arthritis consumer experts, the group that I lead, and many others in our community to engage in education and information activities to help public and private payers understand the value of these biologic therapies, both at the clinical and the patient level. So along with the treatment, the massive treatment leap that we were seeing treatment outcomes we'd never seen before, such as you've seen with many therapies that are used in breast cancer and other cancer treatment armamentariums, we saw this class of medications come forward. But in the pre-biologic era, an annual cocktail of RA medications, RA being short for rheumatoid arthritis, was about $1,000. And in the year 2002, when they began to appear on public and private formularies, that rose dramatically to $20,000 per year. So not only were we seeing a dramatic change in what happened to people living with the disease like me, we saw budgets going up significantly. And it took about 2 years for the first two biologics that came to the marketplace to be listed in only fewer than a handful of our provinces here in Canada. And when they were listed, they were overly restrictive listings through special access criteria, or what's commonly known as SAP. Private payers were slightly more generous, most listed, but not necessarily listed in an optimal fashion, so that, like on the public formularies, you had to fail on a number of different treatments before you were given reimbursement access to a biologic. For biologics 3 through 10 that came into the marketplace, the road to reimbursement was even bumpier. And politicians and payers didn't understand that, in fact, rheumatoid arthritis was a disease that was an individual disease. It wasn't, it's not like in diabetes where it's type 1 or type 2. Rheumatoid arthritis varies from individual to individual. So in fact, what people with rheumatoid arthritis need, and in many types of cancer and in HIV this is likely true, you need personalized or customized therapy. So having the full range of biologic therapies available to patients and their clinicians was very, very important. And just to underscore this, it's not an unusual or a rare problem we were having in order to gain the best treatment possible for our disease. It's a problem that faces approximately 600,000 people in this country who live with one of 3 or 4 different types of autoimmune arthritis that is optimally treated through biologic therapy. So as a context drop, you can say that we fought for these great new therapies, and we fought long and hard, and in fact, for many, it was a superhuman effort. There were a lot of us who were literally writing letters and advocating for reimbursement access from our hospital beds and having to show, gruesome pictures of our destroyed joints to justify their placement on public formularies and asking taxpayers to help support that bill. But I can proudly say that today, most of these are listed on formularies across the country, and most of them are listed in an equitable fashion. So that's the backdrop to SEBs, is that these are similar but not the same, and we'll get into that in a minute. But it's the thing that you're going to be facing, that the breast cancer community is going to be facing in another 6 years. Herceptin, as some of you, or likely all of you know on this call and participating in the webinar, it's a biopharmaceutical product that interferes with the HER2 receptor. And it's used in HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer. It's a first-line treatment with Taxol, and as a single-agent therapy for patients who've received 1 or more chemotherapy courses for early-stage breast cancer that is HER2 positive, and in addition to primary or initial treatment. And it's also been shown to reduce the risk of breast cancer recurrence. So it is a vitally important therapy and treatment option in the breast cancer treatment armamentarium. So think of that medication and something coming in behind it where the availability of it for whatever reason, whether it be regulatory or reimbursement, is under threat. Your community would certainly sit up and take notice, and that's the very reason for having this call. And it's not to suggest that an entry of an SEB following Herceptin's patent expiry is a threat. It's that we need to know what kinds of therapies are going to be coming forward in the future so that we can prepare not only our patients across Canada, but also our caregivers and our politicians. So a little bit more about SEBs now that you kind of understand the concept behind their development, that they started, all SEBs come from an originator. Biologics are large molecule medicines that are administered by injection or intravenous. So these are not garden variety therapies. They are very large molecules, 10,000 times the weight of a typical small molecule, and they're made in living cells. Subsequent entry biologics, or the short form SEBs, are similar, but they are not identical to biologics, and therefore they are absolutely not generics. And Health Canada, our safety and efficacy regulator, has been very definitive about what a subsequent entry biologic is. And this is a very important distinction, not only from a regulatory and a reimbursement perspective, but from a patient perspective. SEBs come from different DNA and cell lines and not the originator biologic cell lines, which is why they are not generics. They have their own complex manufacturing processes, just like biologic, the originator biologic. And in fact, these manufacturing processes are so complex that at any point in time, they're undergoing one out of about 250 different inspection processes. So the manufacturing of both originator biologics and subsequent entry biologics are complex, they are unique, and they undergo a complex manufacturing process from start to finish. SEBs are made by a number of different manufacturers, and there are even now some brand name manufacturers that are developing SEBs. So there are originator biologic manufacturers that will be making, if not a subsequent entry biologic of their own originator, then possibly of another's. SEBs, as I mentioned on the last slide, can enter a marketplace after the patent on the originator biologic has expired, and this is the only aspect, interestingly enough, of an SEB that is the same as a generic medication. It is their entry, the trigger, is the expiry of a patent. That's the only similarity between an SEB and a generic medication. The second SEB to come to Canada is Inflectra, the SEB brand name for its originator biologic, Remicade, or the generic name Infliximab. Infliximab, Inflectra Infliximab, was approved for Health Canada on January 15, 2014, and for 4 indications, although it did apply for 6 different indications, but only received an indication for 4 of them, and they're listed here at the bottom of this slide. One of the big problems that probably jumps out at you when you look at this slide is the use of the word Infliximab and naming, and I'm going to get to that in a few subsequent slides, but you can see right here that already there are some issues for all stakeholders in this process of using a therapy called subsequent entry biologics, and that's a naming issue, and I'll get back to that. I thought it would be useful, although we're here to talk about SEBs and how they're similar and very different from their originator biologic, it's important to know just at a very high level what the regulatory, and in this cartoon shows also the reimbursement pathway for medicines in Canada. You can see there that in the top row of arrows, it starts with Health Canada. Health Canada is our review body in this country, similar to the FDA in the United States and the EMA over in Europe. It is the group charged with assuring Canadians that a product entering our marketplace and entering into human bodies at a market level is responsible for safety and efficacy. And typically, it takes about 1 to 2 years for Health Canada to review a product. And when they say it's safe and effective to enter the marketplace, they give it an NOC, which is by and large a yes. The process then turns to a cost-effectiveness review, and that's done by a body called the Common Drug Review and their expert advisory group that advises this common overarching common drug review process, and that typically takes about 6 to 12 months, and they render a positive or a negative recommendation. So yes, we think this is cost-effective for a province or a territory to list, or no, we don't think it's positive. From there, it goes on to that far right-hand bubble called the PCPA, or the Pan-Canadian Pricing Alliance. It was thought when the Council of Federation of Provinces came together and health ministers got together, they thought, well, let's try to get medicines more cost effectively by negotiating a price with manufacturers together, and thus arriving at what sort of crudely referred to as a bulk price. So kind of like going to Costco for drugs. That negotiation process varies and can last from weeks to months. From that point, a price is arrived at, and then provincial formularies decide whether they're going to opt in or opt out of the deal that's been made through the PCPA process. and they either make a listing decision, and the listing decision basically means it's on the formulary. A non-decision, a wringing of the hands or a twiddling of the thumbs or a no means patients aren't going to benefit from either an innovative or originator biologic or an SEB. I put in here patient support program because originator biologic manufacturers have been providing those to patients as a way of extending the access to their product post-clinical trial, and while this very lengthy process to reimbursement it takes place in our country. And then, of course, the last arrow on the stop is the patient, and they have to also go through, for some, it's hell, trying to get covered by a public or a private plan. There is means testing. A number of provinces have means testing. And I put here this last bullet point under patient that only the informed find their way through the maze sometimes. And that maze, as you can see here, is very lengthy. SEBs, and I've illustrated all of this for you to show you that SEBs, through this process, have actually been given a fast track through most of those bubbles. And it certainly seems to me, to this advocate, that it's the allure of perceived savings or the promise of savings that has encouraged regulators to abbreviate reviews, safety and efficacy reviews. It certainly means that it landed on the CDR and the PCPA's desk more quickly, and that possibly provincial formularies are itching to put them on their formularies because there's a promise of significant price savings. How real those price savings are, we have not yet seen them, although I will tell you something about the province of Quebec that's just listed. And interestingly enough, when I first started volunteering and advocating in my community, there's about 4.6 million people with arthritis in Canada, and now leading the group that I've led for the last 15 years, Arthritis Consumer Experts. The only three pieces on this puzzle were the Health Canada piece, the provincial formulary piece, and the patient piece. The other three didn't exist, so a timeline that took about a year in the best of cases now takes sometimes in excess of 2 years. So it's taking a long time to get good medicines or cost-effective medicines into patients and benefiting the health of Canadians. So that's what an SEB is, broadly speaking, what it's not, how it goes through the regulatory and reimbursement review process, and what ACE did 5 years ago, much like I think the breast cancer community is beginning to do today in anticipation of an SEB coming in following Herceptin's patent expiry, is we took kind of the bull by the horns. We wanted to know as much as we could about a class of therapy that is, in essence, a new class of therapy. These SEBs are getting a brand new DIN number. It's a new drug submission, and they get a standalone NOC. We wanted to know about them years before they arrived, because often in the setting of chronic disease, you're being asked to make treatment decisions and treatment considerations sometimes a year or two out based on what it is you want to do for your life. Whether you want to have a child depends on what therapy you're on, whether that therapy is working, how long it takes a therapy to ramp up to its optimal effectiveness, and so on and so forth. So we wanted to be as proactive as possible. So we hosted a roundtable. We started this education and information delivery process in British Columbia, and we invited patient organizations from all walks of life, not just arthritis, and of course expert groups who we relied on as content experts, and they would include Biotech Canada, the Centre for Drug Research and Development, the BC College of Pharmacy, and now we've done this same kind of work in Alberta and moving it on into Ontario. So that process was vitally important to sharing information and finding common ground on what real or potential issues may be related to a subsequent entry biologics entry into the Canadian marketplace. So we had broad-based discussion. It was very much a patient-centric perspective on the SEB regulation and formulary placement. And then, of course, we published a report on our findings, as any good roundtable would do. And I'm going to cover on the next 3 slides for you 3 sort of what I call buckets of bullet points that came out of our report. So first and foremost, concerning Health Canada, they're really the starting point for any product making its way through a system and into our bodies as patients. And we felt that subsequent entry biologics should be studied in phase 3 trials and in an adequate number of patients for a specific disease in order to obtain approval and reimbursement for that disease. And that's not necessarily the policy that Health Canada landed on. But remember that phase 3 studies are basically what clinicians and patients rely on in terms of generalizable information about its efficacy and its safety. We look to clinical trial data to make a decision about whether we want to take that therapy or not. So it's a very important piece, not only to regulators, but also to clinicians and to us patients. We felt that safety should be assessed in phase 3 studies and in mandatory pharmacovigilance programs. And Health Canada has not mandated pharmacovigilance programs. They often don't. But in this case, with abbreviated data sets and trials to rely on for review and safety, we felt that this was a very important piece. The roundtable and our group of expert advisors also felt that there should be a Canadian-approved biologic as its reference product. So in other words, if Health Canada was reviewing an SEB, that file would have to refer back to a Canadian-approved biologic rather than one that was a reference product in Turkey or in Japan, or a very different health care setting than, and regulatory setting than our own. And then, of course, we were all adamant about the fact that an SEB should have a distinct generic and brand name compared to its originator. And in this regard, and I have to tell you that the Director General has heard this from me personally and understood our patient and patient advocacy groups' points of view. They got this completely wrong, but it's because the group that actually names generic drugs and their subsequent brand names is driven at a world level by the World Health Organization. So actually, the World Health Organization got it wrong, and Health Canada is actively working with the WHO, the WHO, to try to amend this by giving infliximab, the SEB infliximab, Inflectra, some sort of a randomized 4-digit code on the end of the generic name infliximab, so that when we do try to track for safety and efficacy, we actually know which one might be causing sending a safety signal out in the patient population. So this is a really, really important piece that was I think we got it wrong, or they got it wrong, and now they're trying to right the wrong. Regarding patient and physician choice, the roundtable and the experts in BC, Alberta, now in Ontario, have been very definitive about formularies considering listing SEBs, or any biologic for that matter, for a particular indication, that relevant specialists and patient organizations should be consulted as part of that decision-making process. That if we're not using on-the-ground clinical expertise in diseases where very potent medicines are being used, and they're very complicated diseases, as breast cancer can be, as rheumatoid arthritis is, then you need to both benefit from specialist expertise, but also the lived experience and expertise of the patient. We also felt that patients needed to understand the complexities behind the development, regulation, and public formulary listings of biologic therapy and SEBs, and that's why ACE has undertaken a strategic and ongoing plan to share education such as we're doing today with your community. We also felt that the regulation and formulary management of SEBs in Canada should always preserve the patient-physician therapy discussion and decision-making. In other words, try with superhuman effort to keep the taxman or anyone else who doesn't belong in the clinical office with the patient and the physician. Keep those people out of the room, because it is a very complex and confidential discussion taking place around choice of treatment. Lastly, we had some firm thoughts around public formulary policy making with respect to SEBs, and that they should not be listed on provincial formularies in a preferential manner. In other words, patients must not be forced, and their physicians for that matter, through special criteria to try the SEB before the originator. And currently, it has been noted now, watching the regulatory and the reimbursement discussions taking place thus far, that there is actually nothing in policy that prevents publicly funded drug plans from treating SEBs the same basically as a generic chemical molecule for reimbursement purposes. So in the lack of no policy, it's amazing what happens with policy. And it's one of the reasons why we all, I think, at the patient organization level, whether you're in cancer, breast cancer, arthritis, multiple sclerosis, we band together and share best practice, because it is from each other that we learn where mistakes possibly are being made or have been made, and help one another navigate these tricky waters moving forward. So last week, the fact that there was no policy in place and that Quebec rang an alarm bell by listing Inflectra in the same category as Remicade, but they gave it a preference as the lowest price alternative, or what they say in Quebec is a PTD. So NS, the formulary, which is the acronym for their public formulary there, states that even though it's listed as a PPB, or a low price alternative, Inflectra is not considered interchangeable. So that's good. That's good language and completely reflective of Health Canada's position on an SEB. Who is our safety and efficacy regulator? A physician can specify by hand on Remicade prescription that there is no substitution. I'll spare you from my terrible French accent, and I won't read it to you in French, rather just the English version. However, on February 12th, the RAMQ stated, so this is again the public formulary body in Quebec, that when there's a less expensive generic version, a brand name drug may be reimbursed based on its sale price only if the prescribing physician's no substitution warning is accompanied by a code. So now they're saying, actually, if the physician writes no substitution warning, and it's not accompanied by a code that explains why they can't be substituted, so something that's related to the patient's disease or condition, then it will be substituted. A generic drug will be substituted for a brand name. And then further, unless it's stipulated, a patient can still request the brand name drug, but of course they're going to pay the difference, which is the lowest price alternative policy being applied here. Now, we're not certain this is of immediate concern, but it's of concern. Because prior to that, the listing for this particular SEB in Quebec was, it reflected a not interchangeable status of this medication. We're very hopeful that that the policy will not, in fact, drag these biologics into this category, because, of course, they are not generics. This Inflectra is not a generic version of Remicade. So I guess this is a bit of a soap opera in policy form playing out before our very eyes, and you can rest assured that the group that I lead and my colleagues here, our team, folks across the country who are involved in either providing care or receiving this care into their body knows exactly what's happening at the pharmacy counter. And we do that by obviously having webinars like this and producing materials in a strategic and sustained way. So it's not just enough to educate and talk to the people that are making decisions on our behalf, because policymakers, of course, they hear a lot of noise. Our information has to be shared not only multiple times, but through multiple channels, and we need to take advantage of the role of technology in communicating health information, and we would suggest in bold new ways that, in fact, if you're a Twitter user, you probably know, and you follow any of your local politicians, you know that they're avid users of Twitter because they know that's one way of reaching out to their constituents, and of course the same is true for us. I think ultimately what we had hoped to do together, the Canadian Breast Cancer Network and ACE, is to help you take leadership in your community. If in fact you're a person immediately affected by breast cancer, or you're a survivor, or you're a caregiver, either formal or informal, your leadership, even this early in the process in terms of education delivery, it really can make a difference when policy is being formed, whether it be regulatory policy, so for safety and efficacy, or for reimbursement. So there are a number of resources that are made available by our organizations. This is one example of something that ACE did to monitor what happens to biologic response modifiers, and now to new classes of drugs that we monitor on provincial formularies, both subsequent entry biologics and the newest targeted small molecule medications. We actually made our elected officials aware that we're watching. And we watch the minute something gets approved by Health Canada. The minute it's approved, it goes on our medication chart, and we begin to monitor what products do in terms of listing. And of course, when it comes to topics like SEBs, where it's not just a one-stop sort of shop for information, SEBs and what happens to them in the marketplace, and I want to underscore, ACE, nor I as a patient herself, am against the entry of SEBs into the marketplace. We want to make sure that the same level of rigor is applied to classes of medications that are unique, that are different from any others. And so we're here constantly providing information, helping our membership, our subscribership, our advisors and members of the public, helping them understand a complicated topic literally as it unfolds. What we know as even people working at ACE, what we know about SEBs is obviously light years further than we knew 5 years ago, and yet there's something new to learn every day about the topic of subsequent entry biologics and about biologic response modifiers themselves. So what can you do to stay informed about SEBs? Well, we encourage, obviously, patient organizations and leaders like this CBCN to share information with their key advisors and stakeholders. ACE spent a lot of time talking to its ad board and its members to ensure that we were putting out the right amount of information at the right level, reading level and comprehension level, at the right times and in the right places. And we think that's a very important piece for the breast cancer community, as an SEB for Herceptin will more than likely be developed. It's important to talk to governments in lay language, using your language. Basically, our language is their language. They are no more an expert about pharmaceutical management than we are, and they have to learn right by our sides. I think it's our job to assure our patient group members that SEBs are safe and effective, and if in fact that's what our regulator believes they are. and to keep them apprised of any emerging information as they become available in the marketplace. And finally, to ensure that they're assessed properly and appropriately by public and private formularies, and when they're not, to speak out in an intelligible, unbiased way as possible. So on that, I'd like to close. I know we have time now for questions. I again want to thank you, Craig, for working with me to bring this information to the Canadian Breast Cancer Network, and very much have enjoyed our collaboration.
Same here, Cheryl. Thank you so much. Thank you for your very informative presentation and for sharing your expertise and knowledge with us. I think we really can appreciate the really up-to-the-minute information that you provided. I remember working with you last week, and everything kind of shifted as the decisions with the NES came down, and you really kind of put this presentation together as all these developments came at the same time. So it was really kind of good timing, but at the same time a bit hectic to kind of go through both at the same time.
Yeah, thanks. It was a bit ironic, wasn't it? It was though you had talked to them and made it happen.
Well, we try. That's what we try to do here as best we can. I'm only kidding. So I'd like to now welcome participants to submit their questions by typing them into the question box at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Please note that we're not able to provide any specific treatment recommendations through this webinar. These should be discussed with your primary health physician. We will try to take as many questions as possible. However, we may not be able to get to them all due to time constraints. We do want to end around 8 o'clock. So if there's any questions, please type them in, and I'll be happy to relay those to Cheryl. I would like to maybe start with a question, because I think the presentation was incredibly detailed and gave a really good overview of where SEB started within the treatment landscape in arthritis and how it's kind of worked its way through. And I think it really also talks a little bit about sometimes the challenges within our regulatory system between the what the federal government is responsible for through Health Canada and so on, and what the provinces are responsible for, and this becomes sometimes the challenge and sometimes the maze in which we work with. Maybe, Cheryl, can you maybe speak a little bit more to where you think some of the bigger issues are going to be? Is it going to be more on the federal side, or maybe more at the provincial side with access to coverage and so on?
Yeah, so I think it's somewhat equal, Craig. It's a good question, and I have to say that the arthritis community, ACE, even though we were very proactive, the policy discussion had taken place even before we arrived at the party, so to speak. There were things that were told to us in information sharing sessions, for example, about naming, about abbreviated data packages being allowed, about a non-reference. So while we were giving recommendations and bringing the patient perspective forward, I felt at times it was a bit late in the day. The ship had already sailed. So I would encourage the CBCN to be very proactive in gathering your concerns, the people who are affected by breast cancer, and concerned about how follow-on biologic or a subsequent entry biologic will enter the marketplace. What is it that they think? So I think that's a really important piece to help federal regulators make certain that they're doing the best they can to bring a subsequent entry biologic for Herceptin into the marketplace that assures your community safety and efficacy. I think the only way you do that is to tell them what you think is an effective process. I'm not suggesting they're going to create a brand new one for you 5 years after the fact, but certainly as you follow along policy implementation and monitoring, I can guarantee you there will be changes. And when changes start to be made, you want to be a part of them. From a formulary perspective, I think it's really important to recognize that the formulary management system for cancer drugs is different than it is often for arthritis drugs. So many times your products are being adjudicated or reviewed for cost effectiveness in an acute care setting, so hospital budgets, and that's where they're administered, and hospital budgets are in a different place than the budgets that pay for our biologics. So I believe that understanding, though, that landscape may be shifting. For example, P-CODER is now being folded into the Common Drug Review process. And how does that affect timely, satisfactory reviews of cost effectiveness for cancer drugs? I don't know. That it remains to be seen. But I think it's on the part of really breast cancer patients and survivors, first and foremost, to understand where decision makers are tinkering with policy, forming policy, and to insert your voice. And I think many of the lessons, even though the hospital, the drugs are delivered in hospital or in acute care, sometimes versus community care settings or even at home, such as some of our drugs are delivered, it's important to insinuate yourself in a positive way into conversations about reimbursement at a very early stage. So starting with the federal level, safety and efficacy, and then as you tackle some of those conversation challenges, then the reimbursement level. Does that answer your question?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Another question would be, when you started to see the originator biologic in arthritis treatment come off patent, how long did it take before SEBs started to enter the marketplace?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one I probably should have included in the slide deck. Remicade, I believe, came off patent at least a couple of years prior to the approval by Health Canada on January 15th. I could be mistaken, so I can get back to you, but it wasn't immediate. It wasn't like a generic where, for example, let's say Lipitor came off patent and the next day they're filing for a generic. Mm-hmm. You know, or so I'm just using that as an example. Typically, in small molecules, the generic form would come right on the heels. Because subsequent entry biologics, they're a whole new animal, Craig. You know, in the defense of regulators and cost-effectiveness reviewers, this policy is all had to be made, you know, brand spanking new. People have not really known how to handle this class of medications called subsequent entry biologics. And I think that was reflected in the gap to the marketplace. I think that the review and the policy making, they were kind of making policy as these things went through the review process.
It almost sounds like science speeding along and regulations catching up behind in a way.
Exactly, yeah. And now, of course, all you needed to do was look at the slide you started our webinar with, the pipeline for potential SEB development. Ours is just as rich, and we have another biologic, I think, coming off patent next year. And we think probably the delay between that patent expiration and the arrival of the SEB, that may be shorter because, of course, they'll be looking at policy that's already been made.
So another question would be is I think when we look at this even from a global perspective, patents come off, drugs will come off patent at different times depending on when they've been applied to in different countries and so on. Have we been able to see anything globally that has kind of given us a pathway, I guess, to how this will work itself out?
You know, I can't answer that question. I'm not really qualified. It's all I can do to keep abreast of what's happening, that our group can keep abreast of what's happening here in Canada. I'm not sure. I can't answer that question with any great authority. So, but I can certainly find the answer out and provide it to you.
Okay. Well,
but
fair enough.
I
think we learned from today's presentation that it's a very rich and thick topic just in Canada alone, let alone looking at it from a global perspective.
And I'm not certain that the experience jurisdiction to jurisdiction is that dramatically different, but I do believe I've heard or seen in presentations at different meetings around the world that there are definite differences, and that there are one or two jurisdictions where, you know, there have been, for example, extrapolations have been allowed in other jurisdictions, but they weren't allowed in Canada. For example, Inflectra, the subsequent entry for infliximab and Remicade had 2 other indications applied for here in Canada but didn't receive them, yet I believe they received those indications in at least 1 or several other jurisdictions.
Okay.
So there are differences, and then of course there are nuances between the differences, and I couldn't venture to guess unless I actually talked to regulators what those might be.
Sure. Okay. Well, Cheryl, that actually ends all the questions that we had tonight. So I just want to say on behalf of the participants in the Canadian Breast Cancer Network, thank you for joining us for this session and sharing your expertise on subsequent entry biologics. Thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. Please remember that this session will be available for viewing at cbcn.ca. Especially if you missed something or came in late, or I know for me there was such a lot of information, I want to go back and take a look at it again. It should be there within the next day or 2. So thank you, Cheryl, again for giving us this presentation. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and good night. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.